As you can see from looking at our summer offerings, the anniversary of 1969 loomed large in our psyche. So we decided to have several related programs, and we've had a couple. We had a fellow come in and talk about 1969, just the year, 1969. We had a wonderful group of musicians come and play favorite music from the 60s. It was really great. We may have them back. We may even go back a decade and do the 50s. I don't know. They were great. And so when I was going through my mind thinking about fashion, because that was such a big part of the 60s, who should pop into it immediately but Jackie Serbinsky. Some of you know Jackie from her many years of doing a thrift shop fashion show and brown bag lunch here at this library. In fact, she did this for us before we were at this library. We did it at the, what is now the Cultural Center. Tons of work, let me tell you. And Grace Bolo actually was her sidekick in many of these. And Judy, there were a lot of people who helped Jackie, but Jackie did the work, and it was a wonderful event. And it hasn't happened for a while now, I say. No, one look at your face tells me all I need to know. It may not start up again. But I knew that Jackie would be a perfect person. And for those of you who don't know who she is, I'll tell you a couple of things right now. Jackie began her career in fashion with Federated Department Stores and later joined May Department Stores, covering New York, California, and the Far East markets. She then joined Tiffany Loungewear as a merchandiser and stylist before returning to St. John's University for her MBA. Jackie has been Director of Fashion and Marketing and a professor at Kingsborough Community College of the City University of New York for over 30 years. Doesn't look it, but she has. And in addition to her teaching work, she's responsible for all departmental and college-wide fashion shows and events. As many of you know, Jackie donated an impressive collection of American and international fashion design books in the memory of her parents, which are housed in their own section at the far end of the reference area. I think it's near the fax or right scanners and things like that. Right. So take a moment to look at that sometime. In addition to this, Jackie is a former member of the Board of Trustees of the Southampton Historical Museum. By the way, thank you, Museum, for co-sponsoring this with us. And she was on the library, Friends of the Library Board, so she's been a wonderful friend to this library for many years. Please join me in welcoming Jackie Serbinsky.
I have to live up to that great introduction. After listening to all those wonderful programs that are going to be happening, I feel a little diminished standing with all those great people that you'll hear from. I'd like to say a few words first. This is a period that's very close to my heart because I was living on East 86th Street and 2nd Avenue in 1966 and just got out of Hunter College, undergrad, and I was hired by Federated. I had to go back for my graduation. I had to take a day off. I started right away, and one of the things we did, we were importing clothes from Carnaby Street in London. So, I was right there in the middle of it, and I remember owning a fake fur miniskirt. I can't find it. Some of us have it in some thrift shop now. And of course, we all wore false eyelashes and put all the little twiggy, dark lashes below our eyes. And of course, if you came home after a night of being out, your lashes were probably on your Angora sweater or something. So this is a really wonderful time for me. But at the same time, as you know, the 60s was a very tumultuous period. It began with the, as we say, the invasion of the Brits. But it was really centered in London, not New York. It came to New York, obviously. But it caught fire very quickly. One of the things that made it caught fire was the music. The music came across the pond, really at the forefront were the Beatles, but people like the Rolling Stones as well. It was probably one of the most momentous decades in our history. You will see the early years, which we call the mod years, and the late years are the hippie years. When we get to the middle of the 60s, and particularly at 67, we start to turn dark. As you know, those of you who are my age, remember the Vietnam War, and 65, 66, 67, things got really very intense. I remember I lived in Brooklyn, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I commuted into my job, and I remember reading the paper every morning. I'd open the New York Times, and as you know, there would be another list of young men who'd been killed in action. And so it's really, that part of the 60s is a very dark period, and you'll see it reflected in the music and the clothes and the literature of the time. So, but in the beginning of the 60s, this was a very celebratory, optimistic period. This is the time we looked to space. We had the Concorde. People were optimistic about the future. This began, as I said, on the streets of London, on Carnaby Street. Little boutiques were popping up the way they do here in Southampton, but they weren't as expensive as they are in Southampton. London's key designer is Mary Quant, who's, we attribute her to inventing or bringing us the miniskirt. All the couture people started to break away from the chambre, YSL, Courrèges, Cardin, Hoka Rabanne, with leading couture designers who broke away from the chambre. They were actually ostracized because the chambre was very shocked by their new direction. In the art world, we say Andy Warhol with his pop art, which obviously influenced the artists, other designers, textile people, etc. The new direction was driven by this youth market. They called it the youthquake. It was a movement, and actually Diana Vreeland, I don't know if you know who she was the editor of Vogue, and she was very famous. As a matter of fact, there's a great book about her called TV, and she's the one who named it Youthquake. She saw it as a movement that the youth were driving. No longer was it in the hands of the establishment. This new direction, these kids were looking for a new lifestyle. They wanted to dress in fashions that reflected that. They believed in a counterculture whose values were represented by their style, their language, and their music. As we turn to the late 60s, it gets very dark, as I said. We started to see writers like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, who questioned conventional society and actually recommended or promoted the use of drugs and alcohol. As we know, we turn towards the beat culture in the 60s. And this is a quote about these young women at the time. The establishment set the fashion. Now it is the inexpensive little dress seen on the girls in High Street. These girls, all alive, looking, listening, ready to buy anything new that represented the whole spirit. London was the center, the youth hotspot. So this is where it all began. And so I call it the revolution, indeed it was. And here we see, this was replicated by, I think, either Newsday or the Post, showing the day, obviously these are not the Beatles, these are people that look like the Beatles, getting off an airplane, Trans World Airline, dressed up in the period costumes. So I thought it was kind of a cute thing to have to show you how they came and took New York by storm, if not the world. I think Ed Sullivan had them on his program. But these are some of the important things that are happening in the 60s. Of course, we had the space race. We had the Concorde. We had the assassinations, 63, 64, 65. We had Vietnam. We had Mary Quant. We had YSL and others who turned to the street. We had Joan Baez also, who was representative in her music of the anti-establishment, anti-war movement. Twiggy, of course. We had the Beatles, who at the end of the period toured east, away from Western, and looked to the gurus for inspiration. We had the musical Hair. I don't know if you all saw that. Very shocking at the time. But, and then of course we had the Paris riots, and we had Woodstock at the very end. And I think this is the anniversary of Woodstock, and they're still trying to find a venue for it. So I don't know if it's going to happen. So here's just a look at Carnaby Street. This is typical of what you would have seen if you were in London at the time. This was, as you can see, these young women have on what was later described as go-go boots. This was a individual representation. They believed in freedom. They didn't hate consumerism. They just hated the elitist consumerism that had preceded this decade. And so they wanted to make their own styles. So the miniskirt became very important, and actually as far as the couture designers, they began to raise hems 3 years before 1960. So this was starting to happen in the early years, the late years of 1950-59, when the couture started to raise hems. But Mary Kwan kind of took it to its extreme in that she really came out and talked about the miniskirt as an important fashion item. So YSL and others were some of the designers that you know well who looked to the youth for their inspiration, not to the elitists. And he was saying, down with the Ritz, long live the streets. And he really, he also opened in '66 his famous boutique Rue Gauche, which he also was criticized for. Here's one of his looks that we see from his beat look, and you notice the leather and the helmet, which is very reminiscent of Courrèges, and then we have the boots underneath. So he was very much enthralled with the inspiration from this. And here's another look at the Beatles, the actual Beatles actually. Their hair was very important to men in the United States because up until this time men were clean cut. If you remember in the 50s, men really cut their hair very short. That was the style, but came the Beatles. This was considered long hair. This was shocking to some. This was actually not as long as it would get by the end of the 60s. And so we talked about the space age. That was really important. I think this is one of the most important developments of the 60s in terms of design, because this was the idea of the futuristic. Courrèges called it his moon girl on the left. And matter of fact, Cardin is having a show. They're opening a new exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum featuring Cardin's space age clothing. This is one of his pieces, the plastic skirt and go-go boots. So that's very interesting. There are a couple of exhibits that are opening this summer that'll go on into the fall that you can see both at the Met and at the Brooklyn Museum. But if you notice, there's a very kind of architectural look to Courrèges' clothes. Also, he loved white. This is very typical. You see the white go-go boots, the very minimalistic kind of design, but then you also see these edges, very architectural in nature. So, and white was very important. That was sort of the idea of space, optimism, hope, whatever you want to call it. But that was very important. Here's another great one of his pieces. It's a double-breasted A-line coat. Notice the hat, because that again, it sort of, he was influenced by the space race, so his hats are helmet-like, and of course the go-go boots are on the bottom. So this was a very interesting different, and we still see this. If you remember designer Bonnie Casham in later years, her designs were very reminiscent of Courrèges in that her coats were architecturally designed and they had those little sort of edges to them, I would have to say. Okay? And here at the top we have not only Courrèges, but we have Rudy Gernreich, who you might remember for his topless bathing suit. However, this is also one of his, he was involved in this. And you'll notice the textiles are getting really futuristic. They were plastic, they were aluminum, put together with little chainmail joinings. Probably difficult to wear, but it was a representation of the look. And here we get something much more conservative, but again, still has that futuristic look. The helmet hats, very A-line, maybe not as short as some, but short certainly. The squared off jackets. So what I call a space redefined. Now I just want to say a minute about Mary Kwan. She was born in 1934 actually, and she began her, because her influence is important obviously, she began her career as a clothing buyer, but she soon preferred selling her own clothes. So with that, she started to work towards opening her own store in Knightsbridge, and she created it by selling her miniskirt that she believed in. And here we see YSL. So here's that color block. This has really happened because of Andy Warhol, as you know, his pop art that you're familiar with, and this idea of color blocks, which we still have today, is probably one of the most important and interesting influences in clothing today, because so many designers and manufacturers have used the color blocking and made a lot of money from this one idea. And also it was important at the time because of the length of the skirts, pantyhose and tights became really important, so that you wear a color hose to match the hem of your skirt, or or another color. So that was definitely an important influence of the time. So here's a picture of Mary Quant. She also had a typical 60s hairdo. Some of you may remember Sassoon on Madison Avenue and had their hair cut there. He did those wonderful architectural cuts. I have a picture of him later on cutting someone's hair. So this idea of, again, it matched the design of the clothes, the architectural idea of cutting hair in architectural. You have one side long and the other side short. I remember going to Sassoon. I went to college on 68th Street, so it was close to where one of his hair places were. And this just shows Mary Quant with a bunch of her followers showing off their mini skirts. And so there were lots of different versions of it. Here we see the red tight with the red go-go boot, and then the white with the red trim on the mini skirt dress. The dress was really good too because there was no waistline. We dropped the waistline, and so anybody could wear this dress because it hid a lot of defects and made you look slimmer. So this was a really good thing for lots of women. And here we see another look at the color block. This is more prophetic because it followed later on what happened with this color block. Now we could put this dress on today and wear it out, and no one would even think you were abnormal. So I think it has a great influence on clothing. And again, this was the idea of the mini with the space. The go-go boots are really big, and look at their hats. They always had little hats on. All kinds of skirts are very short here. This was in London, of course. We got a little more conservative in the United States, but we were wearing them short. And to the left, you see again, and also these wigs, these dyed wigs made of Dynel. I don't know if you ever had one. I did. I had a blonde wig. And so, because I wasn't blonde then. But you see here, she has red and green. So you could wear another color and get one of these little, luster brown cuts and wear it with your outfit. And you can see, again, very short, very minimalistic, very architectural in design. They have the high knee socks as an alternative to wearing boots, certainly. And of course here, a little more conservative, but again, also short, but also this idea of the color block on the dress. And Biba, maybe you remember this boutique. This started in London. She didn't, her store didn't last too long. However, you might remember Paraphernalia, which opened in New York as well. But she opened in West London in '64, and she made it like a place where people could, sort of like Starbucks, which you could meet and shop. A lot of eclectic clothes, a lot of mini dresses, and lots of vibrant patterns. Her garments were original, they were cheap, and they were creative. So she was very much caught up in she and her husband started this store. She was originated from Poland. Joanne, I don't know if you're here, but Joanna, I should say. And she and her husband began this as a mail order business. And they had this one item, it was a gingham dress, and they sold 17,000 units. Then she decided she was onto something. So then she opened the boutique, and the rest was history. It became an oasis for friends and young people to meet and talk and exchange ideas. So here's another important dress of the time. This was 1965. This is YSL's Mondrian color block dress, which was really, truly, influenced by Andy Warhol. But of course, this dress would look great today. And lots of manufacturers have knocked this off. When I was in the market, we always looked for new ideas, and one of the ways we did it is by taking someone else's idea and then, transforming it into something that we thought was ours. But we called it a knockoff, and that's what it was. It wasn't original. So this is a very important dress. And here we have two important icons of the 60s. On the left was Twiggy. She was 16 years old when she was discovered, so to speak. And Jean Shrimpton on the right. Both of these women became icons for this period. And notice the other thing about Twiggy was her makeup. Remember her eyes? She had she wore false eyelashes, and then underneath were very heavily little feathered eyelashes as well. And her haircut was typical of the kind of cut you might have gotten at Sassoon. Oops. And here we have another typical picture of her. She became the face of 66. All the girls wanted to look like her. Very androgynous. Now this is another thing. The clothing was very androgynous, and that carried over, and even today we see that influence most recently in the clothing of our present day. And here she's featured again. And on the right we see Sassoon, who's cutting that typical architectural styled hair. And there she is on the left. She was what they called an androgynous idol, neither feminine nor masculine. And then YSL, of course, he was very important. Now on the left is a designer you may not be that familiar with, Paco Rabanne, but he was caught up in this space futuristic idea, and all his clothing, as you see on the left, were created from unusual textiles. He used plastic palettes and then connected them to make a dress or a chainmail. And on the right, of course, YSL, very influenced because he brought out the first tuxedo for women. The smoking, we used to call it, right, YSL. And of course, that led women in the 70s to be able to wear pants to work. Prior to that, you couldn't wear pants to work. You had to wear a dress or a suit or something. But once that came on the scene in the 70s, and because of pantyhose, too, that was very liberating for women. We won't see what we had to wear before that, but certainly was a vast improvement. And here's a close-up of one of Paco Rabanne's dresses. You can see how those palettes out of plastic are engineered in a design, and yet they're connected to form this dress. So as we move towards the end of the 60s, things kind of what I call fall apart. The youth rejected materialism and the Western values. We had this counterculture, which began in the early years, but became more so in the late years. The language and the music. Haight-Ashbury, we called them the hippies of the time, were living in communes. The Beatles were seeking a guru in the Far East, and there was a drug culture that abounded. So in retrospect, you can see why it happened. And here's a shot of Joan Baez, who became the sort of the song leader of the anti-war movement. And as you can see, this is a gathering promoting the end of the war in Vietnam. And of course, on the streets of Paris, we saw it as well. So these are the riots that took place in Paris. Kind of a disturbing image. We see some similar images currently, but this is for another reason, certainly. And another part of this drug culture that led to this look in clothing was the psychedelic print or sort of different kind of color matching. On the left, we see a pantsuit made out of different kind of stripings and color with a double-breasted. On the right, we have the psychedelic dress in a really traditional pattern, but done in such a way that it looks different and new again. And at the end of the decade, this represented what they call flower power and drugs and the anti-war movement. So although it doesn't look as sophisticated, certainly as a Courrèges, it became very important to represent the idea of flowers and good things as opposed to the war that we were living through. So these were represented, and I believe Mary Quant was one of the first ones to bring out this idea of wearing flowers. And again, here we see a bigger look, and now we see the idea of the hippies with the love beads, and they wore the headbands and longer kind of flowing dresses and all kinds of colors. And now
if we fast forward to today, just this year, the Wall Street Journal, in their fashion insert, ran a story called Re-Inspired Chanel. So, and the idea of the mod coming back in the couture right now. So this is really interesting because we see the very short skirt, we see the high boots again. Wonder where they got that idea from, right? And Prada did this. This is actually another short little jumper, you can see, with a sweater underneath it. This is all 2019. And of course, here's the very short new piece. Also, I believe this is Prada, full circle I call it, because you know, we see that nothing is really new. I tell my students it's evolutionary, not revolutionary. And here's for Saint Laurent, 2019. Again, a little mini skirt with a kind of psychedelic, kind of interesting pattern sweater, and of course the hat, which is reminiscent of the time as well. So fashion doesn't occur in a vacuum, but it is a reflection of society, the way we dress, what we view as okay. It says a lot about us as a society. If we accept something, it means that we okay it. You know, a trend is the direction in which something is moving, but it is also what society decides is okay for us to wear, the majority of us anyway. The 1960s was the most diverse, the most turbulent, and yet most creative period in our history. This is what we got. We got new directions in textiles. We got the movement of fashion trends upended. In other words, when we talk about trends, we can say they can be top-down from the couture, they can be across, meaning they hit all society at the same time, or they're bottom-up, they start on the streets with young people and low-income people. And so that's what's happening, happened in the 60s, and it's happening now. All the things that are happening in our markets today are really not from the couture, they're from young people. Just look at the clothing on the street, just look at the movement of the sneakerization business that's happening. People speak, witness the social media. People were speaking now. It wasn't, you know, famous people. In 1972, in a publication, Revolt in Style, they said, once only the rich, the establishment set the fashion. Now, it is the inexpensive little dress seen in the girls on High Street. These girls are alive, looking, listening, ready to buy anything new. So they're the ones that are setting the trends. New technology and fashion. I mean, Courrèges was sort of the technological guru of that period. Today, we're seeing things in our clothing, for example, they're embedding chips in t-shirts so you can monitor your heartbeat or other health issues you might have. Of course, you know, we have the Fitbits that we wear and other things like that. The androgynous dressing, which became very important and is still today resurrecting itself. Color blocking, always good. Upending us at the fashion trends. Pantyhose. They gave us pantyhose. How great, right? And pants for women in the workplace, very important. Whoops. Now, I'm just going to switch a little bit for a minute. Spare me a minute. So just this week, this was published, just this week, the British invasion. Oops. And so this was from February 12, 1964. Bad news for U.S. parents, just now recovering from what transpired on the Ed Sullivan TV show last Sunday. U.S. teenagers in the next 12 months are going to spend $50 million on Beatle wigs, Beatle dolls, Beatle egg cups, Beatle t-shirts, sweatshirts, and narrow leg pants. The authority for this frightening prediction is Nicky Byrne, a British businessman who was president of a concern known as Self-Time. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. That's Beatles spelled backwards. Sipping champagne in the Oak Bar of New York's Plaza Hotel, he declines to forecast exactly how much of this $50 million will find its way to the pockets of the Beatles, the four young British singers who are currently mesmerizing U.S. teenagers. It would be cheeky to predict our income, he says. Will the Beatle craze among teenagers reach the dimensions of those which once prevailed for Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley? Do you remember Elvis Presley? My father forbid me to watch it. No one knows. One disc jockey does make the observation, the Beatles are British, and this gives them a touch of class. He goes on to argue, Sinatra and Presley booms were nothing compared to this. I think you might be right. So, as I said, the influence continues. This week, this year, is the 50th anniversary of the Apollo mission, as you know. So there are two important exhibits that have begun. One is at the Brooklyn Museum, as I said, Pierre Cardin, Space Clothes. It'll be there through January 5th. So if you've never been to the Brooklyn Museum, it's a wonderful museum, just fabulous. And right in front of it is the Grand Army Plaza Library. Right in back of it are the great botanical gardens, so you can make a whole day of it and see all great three institutions. And secondly, this will only be there through September 22nd, Apollo's Muse. And so it is a collection of Apollo items and information about the Apollo mission, which I think should be really good. And the one other thing I want to mention is in that article, they talked about, because of the interest in space at that time, it influenced, of course, clothing. And one of the things they talked about was the paper dress. Now, I don't know if you had a paper dress, but I had a paper dress, right? And I'm sorry I didn't save mine. I probably threw it out thinking it's not important. But that was one of the other things that this decade gave us. So it was certainly an important time to be alive. And if you were lucky enough to live through it as I was, you have lots of good memories. So I want to thank you for coming today. And we want to show you some frocks that Judy Sherman was kind enough to bring. And these are out of her wardrobe from that period. So Judy, maybe you want to show us the pieces that you brought. Maybe she'll need some help. You know what? Maybe
Well,
push that.
should we do questions first and then?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe move that around so
Yeah.
that everyone can see. Does anyone have any questions I'd like to ask? Or yes, hi Carol.
In Virginia, when I was teaching third grade.
Oh, Judy, wait one sec. One sec here. Oh, yeah, sorry.
And every time she bent over to help a student, the mini skirt, the short skirts were no good. So kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, we all went and said, please, can we wear pantsuits?
Uh-huh.
Dr. LaFountain was very fussy, he really didn't want them. But we told him, it's not right, we can't teach, even I bent over the desk sometimes. So we did get to wear pantsuits, but they had to match exactly, the top and the bottom. And then after he retired or whatever, I guess we wore the pants, but with a different top.
Yes, he thought he was Diana Vreeland or something.
We were part of that.
Judy?
Mini skirt problem.
I guess I can't bring it down there. No.
Oh, you're kidding. No, I had a real
It's not
thing.
gonna break.
Mine, when you were showing that paper, the
Yes.
the flower design.
Yes,
So
we have something similar down
dark brown version of the one on the left.
Ah,
Did you keep it?
No, some
No,
one.
I
think
know.
I managed to wear it 4 or 5 times, and then since you couldn't wash it.
Yeah, you couldn't wash it right. That was the problem. Yeah, it was kind of neat. though.
Right.
So,
Can you hear me?
maybe we should.
There was a little shop in the village called Etc.
Oh, I remember.
Who remembers it?
I do.
Oh, that's wonderful. Her name was Marie Mirasola, and she did the design in classic suits for Lord and Taylor. But she had this wonderful creative bent about making fantasy clothes, and she opened this little shop in the village, and I fell in love with everything in that shop. And so I had a wardrobe of her beautiful clothes, and I couldn't bear to throw away or give away everything. So I kept a few things, and what I want to tell you, if you could come and see the way this suit is made. Absolutely exquisite. in the design and you can come and look at it. But the surprise is how she lined everything in another color. And so this is purple silk. But you have to see the workmanship, and it was affordable. It was really something. This is very heavy. I left the skirt home, which is very short, and I'll show you the hat. Everything she made a hat. And she was out of this world. Waste of time. But when you put it on, you don't feel the weight.
People can browse around
Yes.
whenever they
There's a
want.
little, it's a Persian lamb. And she did things with red fox and all kinds of wonderful things, and it's marvelous. You don't see this today.
Notice Judy's flower power dress.
Marimekko, that was.
Yeah, Marimekko was really another typical of the time too.
This is another suit.
Let me hold it for you.
Here's the little hat, blue and green. And when you walked, this opened and you saw the different colors. So she always designed that when you walked, your clothes flew around you. Pardon me?
Oh, let me, she has to get it on the camera, so
Oh,
give me that. I'll take a picture of it.
I can't find the belt, I have it, but it was tight here, and all your stomach and your hips and everything was disguised with this beautiful fabric and the pleating. Where's the hat? Okay. Release pleating.
It's perfect.
So you had a beautiful dress that flew away with you. It never clung to you. You were never uncomfortable. But when you walked, it was a very beautiful, graceful movement in every single thing she made.
Yeah.
This is a tent, just falling away from the body, and we used to wear it for luncheons, or you couldn't go into Manhattan unless you were dressed with a hat and gloves. And so this was this. Again, you put it on, and you didn't feel like anything was constricting you, and you felt that you just wanted to fly through the day. This is a black cotton lace, again with the fitted, and this opens too as you walk, and you get that beautiful fluid movement. Please look at this fabric. It's something out of this world. It's,
See the pattern when you.
yes. I don't know if you can see it, but you have to go look at it. And this is the dress with the flowers, but you had to wear this under it. This is all Pellon. See that? Washable. And then this is the petticoat that went under. So when you walk, with each step you took, you got a flash of the petticoat. So you always had this wonderful outfit that was creating, everybody looked at you. In fact, she was the first to make a pantsuit, and I bought it, and my husband almost killed me. He said, "You're not going to go out in that." And I said I did, and everyone stopped and stared, and then within the next few months, there comes the pantsuit, and we still have it today. So I thank you. I hope you enjoy it. I brought these clothes to my granddaughter, but they haven't decided yet. But I think, yes, they will live.
I think so, Judy.
So, okay, Jackie, let me just
Yes.
So Jackie Serbinsky, thank you so much. And by the way, we had our own paraphernalia in Southampton when I was in high school. My twin sister worked there one time. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming.